Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ESI Focus, where I delve into a specific sector of the esports industry with a special guest. In this episode, I'm joined by Amanda Lawson, the co-founder of Hang Loose Media Group, to talk about esports broadcasting and production. Specifically, we'll be chatting about the intricacies of online and offline broadcasts and how both differ from each other. This is the third episode of our four-part series on esports broadcasting, which is actually presented by live production technology company Ross Video. For those who are unaware, Ross Video powers live video productions for global viewers daily by building and distributing live production technology solutions. So specifically for this series as well, we're really happy to have them on board supporting us and helping us through these episodes. So without further ado though, let's get into the episode. Amanda, I've kind of brought you on here today because I really want to know a lot about the production side of things and a lot about the events that are online and offline. Sorry, but first, how are you, Amanda? Anyway.
Yeah, I'm really good, thanks, and really delighted to be invited on and chat to you about all things production. How are you?
Perfect. I'm really good. Exactly. I love talking about production. This is our third episode of the series. We're going to be talking a little bit more about kind of like the workflow and actually kind of building these events, which is actually really interesting as well. Not much of the technical side, but I think it's also a really important point to talk about in terms of how these events are delivered as well, which I think is really interesting. But first, before we jump into all of that, I want the people to know a little bit more about you first. So Amanda, you have a lot of experience in production, but and I don't know if you like to brag or anything like that, but this is your chance to do so. Could you detail, for the people watching who are unaware about kind of your history and your experience?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I'm not one for bragging. That's for sure. But yeah, I'll try and be as quick as possible. So I've spent most of my career in sport production. And have worked across a multitude of sports, from mainstream football, rugby, tennis, cricket, boxing, all the way through to, I guess, kind of more niche, although it's not really niche, where I was working for UFC as director of production for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So that kind of involved, all the live events, all the original content and programming around those events. And then after my UFC kind of reign, I moved into esports because I loved the idea of that as a challenge from a production perspective, because I'd never been in this space before. It's a hugely growing market, as we all know, and I'm someone that loves to kind of move into an area where I haven't really had much experience, and take my experience from working in live, non-live, across a broad spectrum of sports, and bring that into esports. So I was head of content for Gfinity for the last 5 years, and I've worked across a multitude of games, from FIFA to Street Fighter to CSGO. Yeah, you name it, we've kind of covered it. And I've only just left Gfinity actually recently to set up my own business, which is called Hang Loose Media Group. And we are focused on specialising in creating content in the sport and esports space. So I now want to merge the two worlds, my experience in both worlds together, and offer high-end production solutions to everybody and anyone in this space.
That's really interesting. I think, there's a wider topic that we could talk about in a different podcast about how sports and esports are starting to now kind of come together and more in a lot of different sectors. And it's nice to see production also kind of have that, where we're seeing, the likes of Ross Video have now tech go from traditional sports and now into esports. And obviously from a production side, taking the sports aspects and the esports aspects and merging it together into one production company for both. I think it's fascinating kind of seeing everything like that. So we're here to talk about offline events and online events and kind of, just a broad spectrum of kind of how these worked during the pandemic and after the pandemic also. So let's start right from the beginning. So while you're working at Gfinity, obviously the pandemic struck. How was it for you to kind of shift broadcast from offline to online? What was the differences in terms of everything that kind of happened from that point, from your point of view?
Yeah, I think I think the first important thing to say, because in esports, is we kind of been working in an online space for so long. People playing games against each other on a global scale has been going on, since really before the sort of millennium. So the pandemic hit, and it was much more about how you broadcast those events as opposed to how you make it possible for gamers to game against each other, because that's been going on for years. So we were kind of just about to sort of launch into our fourth season of Formula One Esports, and obviously that, as a prime example, has been very much a big event. All the drivers in situ, racing in sims, and building an entire sort of broadcast around that. So when the pandemic struck, we kind of very quickly kind of saw the whole sort of spectrum ahead of all of our events and thought, good grief, what's going to happen now? They're all going to disappear. So I think the first thing we thought about was, how do we carry on doing those events, but in an online way, so that all the drivers, for example, for the Formula One Esports, could compete from home with the same setups, keeping the kind of, I suppose, the integrity of the competition, which is always paramount in these kind of events, keeping that to the fore, but also creating an entertaining spectacle for people at home. So we very quickly moved our sort of, I guess, the way we produce our programs to be able to cope with the fact that we were doing things remotely. So our tech guys kind of instantly sort of made sure that our drivers and the competitors could compete from home, but with all of the right kind of support and tech, integrity to allow that competition to still stay as sort of competitive as it was before. Funnily enough, the pandemic actually made us busier, because a lot of like traditional sport kind of just shut down. They had no way of carrying on. And everybody was coming to us saying, well, what could you provide for us from a kind of an online esports perspective? So we actually got busier. We created the virtual Grand Prix, which was hugely successful from a kind of an entertainment perspective, and from a kind of viewing figures perspective. It got huge views online, and actually on broadcast as well, because nothing else was happening. There weren't any traditional sports competing at the time. So we very quickly kind of said, well, what can we do in this interim period while we're trying to figure out what we do with the Pro Series? So we very quickly created the virtual Grand Prix and invited a wealth of superstars from the world of music, sport, the sort of entertainment sector, to compete against Formula One drivers in a virtual capacity. So instantly we were sort of trying to find ways to keep the momentum going of esports and competition, but produced in a kind of an online or remote way. And we had a huge amount of success with that, actually. As soon as the pandemic hit, we kind of instantly moved into that space and actually got more and more productions online because we were able to adapt so quickly.
It's fascinating, and you're completely right about the virtual Grand Prix. When I remember seeing them happen, and it kind of, sim racing obviously was always a developing scene in esports, but it felt like during the pandemic, sim racing grew in development and grew in audience size, and now you see the likes of Lando Norris have their own esports team, and trying to get into loads of things, like Roman Grosjean having an esports team. So it's like, it really like rose the prominence of sim racing. And I think obviously the ability to do it online and offline, especially considering, in terms of like the equipment that these sim racing drivers have to have as well, like the fact that something like that could be made possible, it could kind of, I guess, open the possibilities of, well, then normal PC gaming can also be made possible, because these people are having to do rigs and everything like that. So in terms of some of the hurdles, what was like some of like the major hurdles for working from home for you guys anyway at Gfinity?
I think really it's basically creating that same level, the high quality level of production that we have always been kind of known for. It's still being able to deliver that level of production from a kind of a remote perspective. And we put so much emphasis on editorial creativity, stories around our competitors and stories around the gamers. And I think, the challenges for us were maintaining that level of editorial when you couldn't go and film with them, you couldn't get in, direct interviews with them when they were kind of in situ. But actually, I know this sounds kind of strange because that was my biggest worry. But actually, for the Pro Series as an example, I found that the drivers relaxed a lot more when they were competing from home. So, as you can imagine, some of the competitors that we have racing in many of our competitions and our broadcasts, from across the spectrum, some of them aren't used to the sort of like being interviewed, having cameras, put on them. They are highly competitive in their field and they are hugely talented at what they do, but they're not necessarily, media stars, straight off the bat. So it's always been kind of like trying to make them feel at ease in a kind of a broadcast environment and getting those sorts of interviews and backstories that enable the viewer to get more, more involved in their kind of background, more wanting to watch them perform because they know a bit about their background. And actually, we found that when they were in their own comfort zone, they were at home, they didn't have cameras on them. We actually started to see them kind of emerge from I guess from their bedrooms. They became much more talkative, much more relaxed, and we started to see their personalities shine. So I think that was the challenge that we had from a kind of editorial perspective. The big spectacle of the big event, not happening anymore. Could we still get the kind of editorial and the high level of broadcast, like whilst we were sort of everybody was remote? And I think in some instances we found that it actually enhanced the production because we were starting to see different sides of competitors. A great example of this is when we did a cricket, an online cricket competition with Willow TV, and we got the likes of amazing stars like Jofra Archer competing against other professional cricketers from Australia, from the West Indies, and they were just sitting at home, in their lounges. Jofra had his dog on his lap, and he was competing in e-cricket. And we probably got the best interview with Jofra Archer that he'd given since the Cricket World Cup, because he was just sat at home. He didn't have big broadcast cameras, sort of pointing in his face, but he was just himself. And I think that was the beauty of the pandemic from a kind of an online perspective. You saw personalities emerge because they were stuck at home. They were comfortable in their own environment as opposed to being in a kind of studio or at a big event. And I think that was the really fascinating the point about remote productions, is that the stars of our series, which are always the gamers and the competitors, they started to kind of relax a bit more and their personalities could emerge a bit more, which was great to see.
I think it's fascinating that you've brought that up, really, because obviously, we could talk about, like the intricacies of events and everything like that and kind of a production standpoint, but in terms of like an event to sell to consumers, to sell to an audience, without content, there is no real event, unless you are like the minuscule, probably people who there for the the high end content of analysis in terms of play-by-play and actual the game itself. Without the content, without the stories, for a general public, it's harder for them to get invested in. And I find that what you've just said there really fascinating, how it kind of changed the content from being in a studio to being now like work from home, in the sense of that, from what you're telling me, then it was like professional, well, always professional, but it was like professional interviews, a lot more kind of traditional sports like, to them being work from home and being a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more kind of easy on the eye. Is that quite interesting to see those two different types of deliveries being made just by the fact that a venue is being changed, essentially?
Yeah, 100%. I think it was, without a doubt, the positive thing, one of the major positive things to come out of the pandemic, and everybody having to adapt to a new way of working. So from a talent perspective, and I say talent in the sense of the gamers, the competitors, and also, our hosts, our casters, everybody had to adapt. So from that perspective, it was interesting because they were in their own comfort zone. They were at home. They were relaxed. You saw a different side to people that you would see at a big event or on a stage or in a studio. And it was a positive side. You saw things that you probably might not have seen, in a broadcast environment. And I think from a production crew perspective, which is also, hugely important, people sort of working from homes could spend more time at home. They weren't having to do the travel into the studio or to a big event. They weren't, they had the comfort. They had the comforts of their own home around them. They felt safe. They felt secure, and actually, they could do their job just as easily from home as they could do if they were making the journey into the studio. So it really changed everybody's mindset about what was possible with remote production. And I think it's probably the biggest takeaway from a broadcast perspective of how you continue on post-pandemic, although we're still clearly not out of the woods completely. But post-pandemic, I now, in my new guise as founder of Hang Loose Media Group, that is a massive focus for us, is remote production and how we create, remote broadcasts that still have that same level of quality, but yet you're kind of creating more sustainable environments. You're not traveling loads of people here, there, and everywhere. You're not the cost isn't as great because you aren't putting people up in hotels. They aren't traveling, and you're still getting sometimes more insight from the people competing because they're in a relaxed environment. So obviously now we're kind of moving out of the pandemic. There's definitely a hybrid model to look at there, because it's nice to have gamers in situ because it creates that environment, that atmosphere. But I think from a production crew perspective, it's definitely something that we're looking at in the future for continuing on with.
Well, that does lead on to my next question. And with Hang Loose Media Group, then, when it comes to kind of deciding whether that's sports or even esports broadcast in terms of, should we have it as an online event or an offline event? Is that conversation a lot more prevalent now than what it could have been like 2 years ago? Because I think the immediate action is everything needed to be an offline event to be seen as kind of an S tier and A tier event, when now it doesn't seem to be as much.
Yeah, I think it completely depends, I think, on the game or the sport or whatever. Obviously, sport is there to be had live. The big finale at the end, the big match, the big, that's all to be live. You can't. Everybody missed that so much in the pandemic. But how you produce that broadcast absolutely can be considered now in a different way to what it was. Gone are the days where the only way to do that is to send, OB trucks, multiple people, people staying here, traveling here, there, and everywhere. I think it's now made everybody adapt their way of thinking, even for, big overseas events like the Olympics or, the Commonwealth Games coming up. And you're talking about international broadcasters from all over the world watching one spectacle in one location. It makes you realize that it doesn't necessarily mean you have to send, hundreds of members of crew to a location to be able to create the same level of quality around that spectacle as you did before. The actual event itself, from an esports perspective, there's still a desire to see big events in esports. People want to go and watch the people that they follow, the teams that they follow. They want to get that atmosphere, that excitement, and I agree with that. I think it's nice to see events coming back into live venues and having live audiences going to watch. But I think the way they're broadcast definitely can be looked at in a completely different light now, because it is possible to broadcast something of incredible high quality and get that engagement with your audience without having to send huge amounts of crew to that destination.
Do you think that that's the main thing that was kind of like missed from just broadcast in general, was having an audience, having that atmosphere? While everything else in an online event is good, having that audience around. We've seen kind of esports start to get more and more audiences. I know that I believe that the LEC final is going to have an audience, or I believe so, at least at this point. So I think that's. Do you think that is something that has been missing? Is having that audience? Does that help a broadcast?
Always helps broadcast. You can never replicate that atmosphere, and an atmosphere with an audience elevates your broadcast without a doubt. I think that's the one thing that everybody missed is that atmosphere, and bringing that atmosphere to light in the broadcast is really, really important. So I think that to be able to bring those back into sort of venues, big events, big spectacles, that's what we've missed, and that's what's great to get back to. But I still believe that how you broadcast that to the world can be looked at very differently now, because it's totally possible to replicate what you do in an OB truck or in a big production gallery. It's totally possible to do that from a remote production perspective now.
I think it's fascinating. Like, obviously, everything that happened with the pandemic is horrible, but it is always like there's always some kind of silver lining that goes through that, and it definitely seems, from what I've even been learning throughout these podcast series, is the fact that production has been able to adapt and evolve and change, and kind of coming out of the pandemic, or you're hopefully coming out of the pandemic, that it remains to be with that as well. Do you think that then, because of these kind of new technologies and everything like that we're actually able to get even more online broadcasts from many other people, many other games, as opposed to what we could have had like 2 years ago?
Yeah, and I think people have come to accept watching more online kind of elements within a broadcast. That's kind of become the norm now. It's not, gone are the days where you looked at sort of, people coming in on video feeds and you thought, oh, well, they obviously haven't been able to get them in as guests, or, it allows you to bring people into a broadcast from all over the world that you would never have normally done before, because it wasn't really seen to be the right way to do things in production. You like, everybody looks to have the big guests in situ, but in esports, a lot of the things that we were doing, we were putting, world famous cricketers together from West Indies to the UK, or Australia and UK. We were joining them together, and they were having a laugh, and they were creating entertaining what they were creating entertainment, because they were having a laugh, they were relaxed, they were playing online cricket together, and it's sort of opened up a world of possibilities of who you can bring into your broadcast, because it's now acceptable to see somebody coming in remotely onto a sort of a program, where before it was probably deemed, not necessarily the things that people would want to watch. The pandemic, it was completely the norm, and actually gives you opportunities to bring people in on a kind of UK centric broadcast from all over the world, to have different opinions and different comments, about the people playing or competing. So, from a, I guess, from a sort of budget perspective, and a kind of a, reaching different audiences perspective, I think that's really important.
And let's be honest as well. If you were, so say like the virtual Grand Prix, for example, if you were making that an offline event in a venue, it would probably cost quite a lot and be a logistical nightmare to bring all of these F1 players and all these celebrities in one place. It would be, it just wouldn't be able to be done, I think, right now.
It would never have happened. It would never, ever have happened. It would never have been a possibility. And, it's sort of looking back on that time, it was crazy. We were getting, the likes of Sergio Aguero, Ian Poulter, like Liam Payne from One Direction, like all of them competing and wanting to be part of it, because it was the pandemic, nothing was going on, and they wanted to compete in a kind of a competitive environment against Formula One drivers, and we had Lando Norris, we had George Russell, we had such big names from the world of sports and entertainment, and that would never have been possible before. People would have laughed at us if we'd even suggested it, because they would have said that you'll never ever in a million years make that happen. And look at the entertainment it provided, and look at what it did for F1 esports, and actually for kind of, I guess, esports or sort of competitive gaming in general, that was a mainstream product that people were kind of engaging in and watching. And it opened up what esports can do from an entertainment perspective to a mass audience, which is, it can only be a positive.
Yeah, and I think it's I think what you've outlined is perfect in the way of like there is definitely a need for these big, offline events with players in stadiums, especially, like I remember watching the League of Legends World Championships where it was kind of there were still players, but wasn't even an audience, and it just felt not right. It didn't feel as
Oh,
grand. Well, obviously
yeah.
when I remember in I think it's like 2018 or something where they had like a full stadium of people around. It's like, so you still need those events like that. You need that grandiose for esports and esports events, but then also it's not now you have to have a venue to be a successful esports event or a successful esports series. And I think that
Yeah.
that's really fascinating.
Yeah, and I think it opens up possibilities to bring kind of celebrities into the equation. We all know how difficult it is to get celebrities competing and taking part in things, especially with their schedules. They're already very busy doing sport or music or whatever. So to be able to bring those people into a broadcast and open it up to a different audience because they can sit at home and compete. We did a celebrity Street Fighter tournament for Cadbury's, and it was kind of a family sort of environment. It was fathers and daughters. It was kind of like grandmothers and sons competing in a Street Fighter tournament. So it's very funny. Like that sort of thing just wouldn't have happened before. But the fact that they could compete online together and they were like challenging each other remotely, just opened up possibilities that you wouldn't have been able to do before. So from a sort of celebrity angle, I think the remote production or online events really took off in the pandemic and kind of showed people that don't normally watch competitive gaming actually how entertaining it can be.
Yeah, I do want to talk a little bit about esports and sports productions as well, given that, you, Amanda, have covered both. It's very rare that you see someone who's covered both in such an extensive matter. Do you think that esports' strength is the fact that it is ability to do these online broadcasts? As like you said, it's sports, it's nigh on impossible to, at least from a spectator standpoint, to actually do these massive events online.
I think it's definitely a strength. Esports really was the only sport that was able to carry on during the pandemic. Everything else had to shut down. We could continue, and it was probably one of our busiest years. We did a FIFA challenge. We were doing the EPL finals remotely. We did a Man City challenge, for charity. So all of those things could carry on because it was online and because gamers have been used to competing against each other online or remotely, if you like, for years and years and years. So it wasn't a new thing. It was just the way that we put that on as a sort of a broadcast product. That was what changed. So I think it's a huge strength that you can bring people from all over the world. Doesn't matter what destination you're in, as long as you've got a good internet, you can basically bring people in. You can have high quality video feeds, high quality audio, and they can compete in a really competitive environment. And it's how you bring that to life with your hosting of that broadcast, I guess. It's how you bring that to life and bring the stories out around it that obviously makes the broadcast even better. But I think it's a huge strength that esports has the ability to connect people from around the world in a competitive way, because that's sport for me is competitive, and it's amazing that esports has the ability to do that no matter what circumstances are going on kind of outside.
Perfect. And in terms of then with UFC, how does a production for a UFC event and a UFC venue differ as opposed to an esports offline event?
That's a really good question. It's I guess the biggest thing when you look at a big broadcast is the facilities that you put around it. So people would expect it to be hugely different in the esports space to the sports space. It actually isn't. If you're looking at doing the same level of kind of broadcast as you would do at a big live sporting event. You've got to build out an arena, you've got to put an amazing lighting rig in to kind of bring it all to life. You've got to have those specialist cameras that show the movement and sweep across the crowd and all that kind of thing. You've got to rehearse the big moments. So the big walkouts that we used to do for UFC were probably the most rehearsed thing of anything that I've ever done. We rehearsed it to make sure that those moments were kind of as amazing as they always are for UFC. But I kind of take the same level, I suppose, the same prep and the same level of planning for a big sort of sporting event as I do for an esports event. And actually, when we did, for example, the Call of Duty World League at the Copper Box, which was again is a big arena event, I guess, that you have to build out from scratch. We used standard big OB trucks to do that. We were doing about 4 streams, multiple streams going on at once. So we had an A stream, which was the all singing, all dancing stream. We had a B stream, which was still hosted and had different kind of presentation talent. We had a C stream, a D stream, because there were so many games going on at once. And actually, the OB provider that we used kind of came to us and said, "You've literally maxed out every single input into our trucks. We can't give you any more." And that's kind of not normal in a sporting environment. These OB trucks that go on to sporting events, like they've still got capacity to do things in the truck. We had maxed out every single input that they could offer us. So I think that shows the level of technicality that goes into an esports event compared to a sports event. But I think, the planning, the prep, the making the show, the editorial, the content, the kind of the level of planning that you put into it, I don't actually think differs very much. I think the end game is to create a real spectacle that is going to wow an audience, and it's the same for sport and esports.
That's fascinating. But do you think that there's also then, is there something actually that you can learn from traditional sports which is still yet to go into esports? Or do you think that everything's kind of checked off?
Oh, I definitely think there's lots to learn from sport. I mean, like my argument coming into esports was always, well, why can't I show the game? Why can't we cut the game in the way that we can cut, a game in esports? So why can't I have the choice of cameras in the game that I can when I have a football match, or football's a great example. So why can't I cut the game like you see a normal football match? And I think that is definitely coming. I think game developers, publishers, a lot of them do, when they're building their esports side of the game, they are looking at ways to have an instant kind of connection to the audience by providing more kind of broadcast ready sort of esports builds of their game. So because people do want to see the actual game itself, they want to see the story come to life. And it's sometimes a lot more complicated with esports, because you've got 5 people running around a map competing against another 5 people, and you've got so many things going on at once that you have to try and tell that story. So some games are amazing when you can just put as many cameras you want into the game, and you can start to kind of direct the cameras within the game. Other games are more basic because you don't get that option. And I think the other thing to take from sport production is the editorial around it, and the storytelling, and the build up content that goes before the big live competition. I suppose that's kind of where I put so much emphasis on whether a program or a broadcast is successful. It's how are you driving the viewers to that live experience? What are you doing to promote that match, that game, whatever it is? What are you doing as build-up content? And I still think there's a lot more stories to be told in esports that often don't get shown, to kind of widen that audience a bit, to stretch that audience out more. Hardcore fans of esports are going to watch no matter what, but how can you bring new audiences into a game? And I always think that's the editorial, that's the telling the stories, the backstories, telling the story of the game, telling the story of the publisher, telling the story of the participants, the competitors. And I think there's a lot more that can be told in that regard, and something that I put a lot of focus on in the things that we do.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. I think obviously esports is growing in popularity, is starting to drip into the mainstream. But I think the main thing that I always think of personally, anyway, is that with football, not everyone has even played a game of football before in every country, but people know exactly the rules of the game, how the game is, and it's something that maybe is just on the TV, or if there's an article, they'll maybe read it or they'll maybe watch it. And I think it's kind of, to get to that level, esports needs to have that similar kind of content, that similar awareness to the everyday person walking down the street, I think, right now.
Yeah, and I think there are so many kind of stars out there that haven't been discovered because so many people play games, right? There are so many people that play sport, but the very, very, very good ones, the pros, have always been discovered. Their stories have been told. It's very hard to find someone, that hasn't been discovered from a sports perspective. In esports, there are so many people out there that probably are hugely talented at whatever game that they play, that haven't made it kind of from a sort of a professional perspective yet, but the backstories and the kind of the stories of the games, the history of esports, all of those sorts of things that open this space up to people that don't sit spending hours and hours and hours playing one particular game. It's still interesting. It's still a fascinating story. And I think, to open it up to a different audience, I think it's important to tell those stories because they're exciting and they're interesting.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's going to be really interesting. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens kind of in the future as well. As we start to wind down, I do want to ask one last question, and I think it's quite an interesting one, because what is kind of your biggest takeaway during your time at Gfinity that you're going to look to implement at Hang Loose Media Group?
I think to sum this chat up, which is a great thing to sort of conclude it with, is I definitely think flexibility of working environment and taking the whole concept of being agile and flexible and being able to deliver really high end broadcasts in a different way to what's been done before. So looking at the remote solutions, looking at greener solutions to broadcasts, looking at the welfare of your production crew, making sure that people are getting a bit more time back in their lives so that they can enjoy life as well as enjoy coming and working on big productions. I think all of those things combined, creating greener solutions to production, creating an amazing environment for your production crew so that they get a bit more time back in their lives, so that they can enjoy things that they probably never used to enjoy, having spent months on a production. I think that's probably the biggest takeaway. And also, to always maintain that level of quality throughout all your broadcasts, no matter whether it's remote, whether it's you're on site, whatever you're doing, it's always thinking about, how to engage that audience, and how to kind of create stories and create a spectacle that is going to excite the people that are watching at home. And I think if you always take that as your core purpose for every broadcast you do, then I think, you're highly likely to create a successful one.
Amanda, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you about this, and I know that we could probably go on a little bit more about the esports production and the world as itself, and I'd love to talk to you about the sports aspect as well and everything, but we are strictly an esports podcast, so I will refrain myself from this one. But yeah, Amanda, thanks a lot for taking the time here.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me, and I'm happy to come back whenever you want to talk sports, esports, whatever. So thank you very much for having me. Have a great day.
And that's it for today's ESI Focus. It was a pleasure to have Amanda on today's episode, and I really can't wait to see what Hang Loose Media Group does in the future. Just a reminder, though, that this was made possible thanks to Ross Video. So if you do want to check out more information about their esports solutions, then check out their esports page at rossvideo.com. If you want to leave a comment on YouTube as well, it'd be much appreciated. And also, if you want to subscribe onto our YouTube channel as well, that'd be also much appreciated as well. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and any social media platform that you find us on. But until then, though, I'll see you next week.